retaliation from Canada was similar. So Canadians wanting to import many American goods will need to pay a 25% tariff, with more items being added in 21 days. And Canadians might really feel the pain, with Immigration Minister Mark Miller warning that up to 1 million Canadian jobs were at risk, and adding, "We can't replace an economy that is responsible for 80% of our trade overnight, and it's going to hurt." With one of the industries that'll likely get slammed by these tariffs being the automobile industry. Right, and that because much of its production spans the US, Canada, and Mexico. With us seeing, for example, the BBC having a great outline of just one part: pistons. Right, with that, aluminum is sent from Tennessee to Pennsylvania to be turned into rods. From there, it goes to Canada to be shaped and polished, which means an additional 25% on the cost. It then goes to Mexico to be turned into pistons, and from there, it goes to Michigan to be added to an engine. But before that, the American importer needs to pay Uncle Sam another 25% tariff. Also, speaking of Mexico, as I'm recording this, they just said that they expect to respond on Sunday. And all of this as the response to the tariffs have been wide-ranging. Right, I mean, one of the things we saw is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau giving a somber speech this morning.
I want to speak first directly to the American people. We don't want this. We want to work with you as a friend and ally. And we don't want to see you hurt either. But your government has chosen to do this to you. As of this morning, markets are down, and inflation is set to rise dramatically.
And he's right about the markets. Leading up to the tariffs, essentially all of them have been falling. The Dow is down nearly 3% over the past 5 days. The NASDAQ is pushing 5%. The S&P 500 is hovering around 3%. And Canadian stock exchanges are similarly feeling the news. But then also, going back to Trudeau, we saw him go on to say,
they've chosen to launch a trade war that will, first and foremost, harm American families. They've chosen to sabotage their own agenda that was supposed to usher in a new golden age for the United States.
And one of the things that Trudeau was particularly upset about was that Trump had justified the tariffs as a response to Canada not doing enough to stop fentanyl from being smuggled across the border. But as Trudeau pointed out, and as we have reported in the past, less than 1% of fentanyl actually comes across the Canadian border. But really, none of that matters, as the goalpost has now been moved, with Trump also claiming that Canadian banking laws are not fair and writing this morning, Canada doesn't allow American banks to do business in Canada, but their banks flood the American market. Oh, that seems fair to me, doesn't it? To which Trudeau actually said,
I heard he talked about banking again this morning in a tweet, which doesn't make any sense, because American banks, there's about 16 American banks currently active in Canada, holding about $113 billion worth of assets in this country. So the American banks are alive and well and prospering in Canada. It's an example of not really being able to see what it is that he wants. What he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us.
Now, granted, Canadian regulations for banks are pretty strict, but their law does allow American banks to even operate on the retail side of things. And, the list of American banks currently operating in Canada includes some of our biggest, like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, US Bank, JP Morgan, and Northern Trust. And in total, American banks actually account for half of all assets held by foreign banks in Canada. We also saw after this Trudeau going on to stress that Canada will never be the 51st state, while also conceding that, yes, the US can certainly hurt the Canadian economy. Trudeau, seemingly, like many, also confused about the change in US foreign policy.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Now I want to speak directly to one specific American, Donald. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do. We two friends fighting is exactly what our opponents around the world want to see.
Which, if you didn't see the very right-wing Wall Street Journal op-ed board, they put out a piece called "Trump Takes the Dumbest Tariff Plunge," with them then going on to say, "We courted Mr. Trump's ire by calling the Mexico and Canada levies the dumbest in history, and we may have understated the point. Mr. Trump is whacking friends, not adversaries. His taxes will hit every cross-border transaction, and the North American vehicle market is so interconnected that some cars cross a border as many as 8 times as they're assembled." Also, I'll say, in addition to Trudeau, elsewhere in Canada, we've seen local leaders pushing for a harsher harsher response. Like, for example, you had the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, wanting to cut off energy to the United States and is encouraging all the provinces to do the same. And on top of that, he wants to block exports of key materials like uranium and potash. I mean, even in the United States, we've seen a lukewarm response to the tariffs, with, for example, Republicans like Rand Paul tweeting out, US tariffs inevitably bring Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese tariffs, which means higher prices for lumber, steel, aluminum, and more expensive homes and cars. And adding, retaliatory tariffs lead to lowered US farm exports, lowered bourbon exports, and less international shipping. Tariffs are taxes, and if you tax trade, you'll get less trade and less prosperity. Though with all that said, you have some claiming that we're already seeing the tariffs be successful. Right in that, because you have companies like Apple announcing plans to spend $500 billion within the US over the next few years. With that money said to be split between expanding manufacturing as well as training new hires and projects like Apple TV productions. Then you also have Oracle, OpenAI, and SoftBank all announcing that they were spending $500 billion on a new company called Stargate that would focus on AI infrastructure across the US. So the latest so-called win for those who support tariffs is TSMC. Right in there, the Taiwanese chip manufacturer that essentially all advanced computing relies on. And yesterday, they announced they wanted to spend $100 billion to grow its US manufacturing operations. A move that'll expand their American manufacturing to 4 fabrication plants in total that will range from manufacturing chips to assemblies that combine components into advanced systems. With Trump praising the move, saying,
"This is a tremendous move by the most powerful company in the world. It's a matter of economic security. It's also a matter of national security for us."
With them also saying they would help TSMC spread their manufacturing out from just Taiwan, where it's arguably vulnerable to a Chinese attack. And this, as TSMC's chairman and CEO predicted that these expansions would mean that 40% of the global chip market comes from the US, though I will say such a goal is considered ambitious. However, it should also be noted that TSMC is generally reluctant to open manufacturing centers that produce their most state-of-the-art components outside of Taiwan. News like this has caused some people online to praise the Trump tariffs, saying things like, to all the people saying tariffs don't work, here is TSMC saying they are going to invest $100 billion in the US, build 5 new facilities, and create 20,000 American jobs. Probably just a coincidence. Although to attribute 100% of this situation to tariffs, that's disingenuous. The Biden administration had worked hard to give companies like TSMC huge grants to expand their US operations. But all of that said, as far as the big picture here, it is widely expected that the net results of the tariffs, it's gonna mean that economies across the world are gonna take a hit and prices are gonna skyrocket. Though honestly, we're gonna have to wait to see how all this plays out, both in the kind of grander scope, the more generalized scope, and with more of the specifics. Specifics like with each country, including, we need to wait to hear from Mexico on Sunday, as well as general updates and general tariffs. With, for example, starting next week, we're supposed to see tariffs on all aluminum and steel, regardless of where they come from. And then in April, that's supposed to be on agricultural products and foreign cars, regardless of their origin. We'll cross those bridges when we get there. And in the meantime, I gotta ask you, what are your thoughts here? Because for the newbies here, yes, this is a news show, but I also want it to be a conversation. So whether it be on this or anything else that stands out to you today, let me know what you're thinking in those comments down below, and you might actually get featured in commentary at the end of the video. But then, shifting gears to an update on a story we covered yesterday, Hasan Piker's ban is already over. And that ban that ended up just being a 24-hour suspension came after he said this late last week while reacting to a clip of House Speaker Mike Johnson talking about Medicare fraud.
If you cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott. Okay.
With that then festering for several days, many arguing that it was an open call to violence against Rick Scott, who's a US Senator from Florida. Within all of that culminating into the ban that happened yesterday, though that has now been lifted. But also, before that got lifted, he put out a video on YouTube last night titled, "I Got Canceled." In it, he walked back his language, but also still dug into Scott.
Okay, so obviously, I shouldn't have used hyperbolic language, and there's definitely some ownership that I must take. Some apologies there. I should not have said Mike Johnson should kill Rick Scott. I should have simply said Mike Johnson should punish Rick Scott, perhaps with the, maximum punishment, whatever that would be, for defrauding Medicare and Medicaid for over $1.7 billion.
Right, and to give some context there, what he's talking about involves a healthcare company that Scott founded in the 80s called Columbia Hospital Corporation, with it then later going on to become the largest for-profit healthcare company in the country, with Scott serving as its chief executive, at least until he was then pressured to resign in the 90s after a massive fraud scandal, which in part accused the company of overbilling Medicare for services that it provided, as well as alleging that it illegally structured business deals so that Medicare picked up the cost of corporate expenses and provided doctors with kickbacks for patient referrals. With the company eventually agreeing to pay $1.7 billion in fines to the government, which at the time was the largest healthcare fraud settlement in US history. And while Scott has recently called the scandal political persecution, you had Hasan calling out what he sees as major hypocrisy in the Republican Party and adding,
I was obviously not asking for people to kill Rick Scott. I think that would be ridiculous. I think that justice should be served, however, and justice has not been served against Rick Scott in this case. Justice rarely ever gets served against rich people who exploit others, against rich people who defraud the federal government, you get a $10 million